Well, I have the pleasure of introducing Emily Wirzba. She is a policy associate for sustainable energy and the environment at FCNL, which is Friends Committee on National Legislation in Washington, D.C. And FCNL is the oldest faith lobby in the country. It was started in 1942, and they have done a remarkable job in working with our representatives in Washington. And I will turn this over to Emily.
Thank you. I'm so glad that I can be here to speak with you all, some of you again today. So before I begin talking about our work and why we think Florida is such an important place to be working on climate change, I wanted to give those of you who haven't met me yet a brief introduction to who I am. So my name is Emily, and I'm most recently from North Carolina in the Hillsborough, Chapel Hill, Durham area. And I went to school at Furman University in South Carolina, and there I studied political science and philosophy with a concentration in poverty studies. And I was really interested in figuring out how do you combine policy and ethics to ground your policy on a really firm foundation of values and ethical beliefs. So coming to FCNL was perfect for me because we are a faith-based lobby organization. And I am not Quaker. I was connected to FCNL through my grandfather, who was a UCC pastor, and he was a big peace activist growing up in Cleveland and Chicago. So he was connected with the Friends Committee and told me about that organization. So I originally started working at FCNL August of 2013. I was a young fellow with them, which was a year-long paid fellowship for recent college graduates. And I had worked in college for 2 summers at Duke University's Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions. So I had had exposure to environmental policy and was really interested in that work. Also because my father teaches at Duke Divinity School, and he teaches the intersections between theology and the environment and agriculture. So I had kind of grown up with this background in how faith and the environment are so intertwined. So coming to the Friends Committee was perfect for me. And so since I was a young fellow, was hired to be a second-year fellow, and then recently hired on again to stay as a lobbyist. So I'm really excited to be able to continue my work with FCNL and in the environment. And so really briefly, for those who aren't familiar with FCNL, we're the Quaker lobby in the public interest, and we represent Quakers from across the country. Through a consensus process, Quakers in yearly meetings have told us what our priorities should be in terms of the legislation that we work on. And then our lobbyists, we have the largest team of peace lobbyists in the country, which is great. So we then work on a whole host of different issues. And briefly, I want to read to you our vision, the 4 we seeks, which help guide all of the legislative work that we do. So that is, we seek a world free of war and the threat of war. We seek a society with equity and justice for all. We seek a community where each person's potential may be fulfilled, and we seek an earth restored. It's a beautiful vision, and the way that we try to enact that is through working with Congress. So I work on climate change. Where are we with that? As you all know, not in great shape. I last fall had a really incredible opportunity while I was at the People's Climate March. FCNL helped convene a small gathering. We call them quiet conversations. And we invited the chief scientist on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. His name is Dr. Pachari. And he came and spoke to us and to 20 multi-faith leaders from around the New York City area. So we had all the major religions represented, and Shelley Tannenbaum was there. For those of you who know her. So it was a really wonderful opportunity where this chief scientist was able to tell us, how do we focus on translating the science better to faith communities so they can better understand and better talk to people about what's really happening. And a lot of people still don't think that the science is settled on climate change, but he told us some numbers that I just want to share with you that I think paint this so clearly. So their most latest report, the IPCC report, was conducted by 830 scientists from 85 countries, and they looked at 9,200 peer-reviewed studies, and then came up with the conclusions that they did. And so when people talk about the science not being settled, that's just false. 97% of scientists think that humans are causing and contributing to climate change. That's the same percentage of scientists that will tell you that smoking cigarettes causes lung cancer. So nobody seems to doubt that or question that. So I love that statistic because it so clearly paints how serious and real this problem is. So when you kind of look at the situation on climate change, most scientists agree that at the maximum, we can't allow temperatures to rise more than 2 degrees Celsius or 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit. And others will argue that even that is way too high. So you look at what's needed to keep temperatures from rising that much. You need an international climate change treaty. All the countries around the world have to agree to reduce their emissions. So if you have this level, so what's keeping the international community from action? Well, the United States is actually a huge factor in why the international community can't pass this treaty, because they know that the U.S. is blocking it. So you look at the U.S. level, and you have President Obama, who's done a lot of great things with his executive authority to try to reduce our emissions through his Clean Power Plan, looking at reducing emissions from coal-fired power plants, future and existing. So he has these fuel standards that he's enacting. He's trying to do a lot, and it's great improvements, but ultimately, to get the comprehensive emission reductions that we need to see, we need the U.S. Congress to pass legislation. So you look at Congress, you got international to the U.S. to then U.S. Congress. Now, why isn't U.S. Congress acting? Well, it's because half of Congress doesn't think that climate change is actually happening. Or I should modify that and say half of Congress doesn't publicly think that climate change is happening. We've been in countless offices, and most members know and fully believe that humans are causing climate change, but they're not publicly saying that. And I'll get to that in a little bit later, but my supervisor, Jose Aguto, who some of you know, Jose and I had the opportunity, the privilege also, to meet about a year and a half ago with a woman named Cristiana Figueres, and she is the head of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So she oversees all the climate negotiations that happen at the UN level, and she told us that U.S. Congress is the most critical institution to move on this issue in order to get international global action. And she said, it's actually the job of the U.S. faith community to really try to connect with Congress and change them on this issue. So she told us that this is the most important thing for global action right now, is to try to move Congress on this. So that's really kind of exciting to hear, but overwhelming to hear a little bit. That's a big responsibility. So when we think about how do we change Congress's mind on climate change? Well, what can one person do? Well, as an individual, you have lifestyle decisions. So maybe you eat less meat, or maybe the way you consume is different. You buy secondhand products. Maybe you choose not to drive, or you drive a hybrid, or you ride your bike or take public transportation. So that's, on an individual level, these are decisions that I can do. As an individual, I can write letters to the editor, I can write op-eds for my local newspaper to kind of widen my voice throughout the community. I can participate in marches, like I went to the People's Climate March. I can do direct action and use my body to show how much I care about this issue. And then I can talk to my elected officials. And that's kind of where FCNL specializes in the lobbying piece. And we think all of these pieces are so critical to seeing action, but we really see so much value in engaging in respectful dialogue with members of Congress to try to shift their stances on this issue. So the current situation in Congress is incredibly partisan about this issue. And I think there are a number of reasons why climate change is so controversial now. And if you remember a few years ago, there was a commercial with Nancy Pelosi and Newt Gingrich sitting on a couch, and they both talked about together how climate change is the most important issue facing the country. You can't imagine that happening now. So what happened? I think for a variety of reasons, this has become politically toxic. One is the amount of money in politics. I think a lot of people, the campaign contributions they get from the Koch brothers, from oil and gas industry is huge, and they're afraid of losing that money. I think deeply rooted in this is fear, and the fact that if we truly admit that we're having the impact on our world and our climate that we are, that means huge investment of capital, of technology, of time and energy to try to prevent this from happening. And we have all the infrastructure already set up for a fossil fuel economy, so it's so much easier to just stick our head in the sand and pretend like this isn't happening. So I think that's another big reason why members of Congress aren't acting. Another reason is that they don't feel like their constituents will support them if they do take a stance on climate change. So one of my favorite stories, a good example to illustrate this is what happened to a man named Bob Inglis. I don't know if anyone is familiar with him, but he was a Republican congressman who represented Greenville, South Carolina, where I actually went to college. And he was, he still is very, very conservative Republican. He, has 100% rating from the NRA, from all these different conservative organizations. But one day, his children, he had a son who I think had just turned 18, and he said, he went up to his dad and he said, "Dad, I love you, but I'm not going to vote for you unless you change your stance on climate change." And his dad said, "Whoa, okay." So Bob Inglis proceeded over the next few months to learn as much as he could about the science. He went with a team of scientists to Antarctica, looked at the ice core samples. He went scuba diving and saw how ocean acidification was affecting coral reefs. And he underwent this spiritual transformation when he realized, wow, we really are having an impact and we have a moral obligation to do something about it. So he returned to South Carolina and he campaigned on a carbon tax and said, this is a free market way we can address this problem, and I think we need to do this. And he immediately lost his primary to a more conservative Republican. And so that what happened to him serves as a fearful reminder to a lot of members in Congress right now that they might come out on a stance and then they'll lose to somebody who opposes their belief. So then, and this is something that I've continued to see. I go into a lot of, so as a disclaimer, FCNL is very, very much nonpartisan. We work with members from both political parties, and we don't support any candidates for office ever. But I think my program meets with a lot of Republican offices because we think that's a population that needs to shift their stance on this issue in order to have comprehensive climate legislation pass Congress. So I was in a Tea Party Republican from Florida's office a few weeks ago, talking. I spent, I think, like 90 minutes with their staffer, who was my age, who works on climate change and the environment. And he said, of course we know climate change is real and that humans are causing it, duh. And the member knows that too, but he would never come out and say that because he would lose his election, and people in the district don't think it's happening. So why would he say that and risk his seat? And I hear this over and over again, that members of Congress know the climate reality, but they don't feel like they have the political space or the support to come out and actually say that. So at FCNL, one of our primary goals in our program is figuring out how do we provide members of Congress with the political courage to kind of come out on climate change. And we use the Alcoholics Anonymous tenet that in order to solve a problem, you have to admit you have it first. So when we look at, what can FCNL do to help ensure that Congress passes comprehensive climate legislation? And the answer for us, rather than working on the solutions at this point in time, is getting this basic acknowledgement of the problem. So we have this effort that we call the Call to Conscience on Climate Disruption. And what this seeks to do is elevate moral and faith voices to talk about why action on climate change is so important. So when we go into an office, we don't talk about the science. We don't try to get into a big debate about, the latest report, because first of all, because that really won't get you anywhere. They either know and agree, or they don't really care to have that conversation. I know I'm not going to change their mind necessarily on the science, but if we help get constituents to come in and talk about why this is a deep concern because of, they care about God's creation, or they're concerned for their children and grandchildren and future generations, or they're concerned about vulnerable communities and the least of these, that they know climate change is impacting the most. That's a way to connect with the legislator and provide them a different angle to then change their mind on something. So we work a lot with interfaith delegations because how much more powerful is it when you have not just a group of friends coming in, but you have a Quaker and a Catholic and a Jewish person and a Presbyterian and a Baptist all coming together and saying, look, our different faith perspectives all lead us to say that God's creation is worth protecting, or these communities are vulnerable to climate change and we have a moral obligation to act on this. And that's a message that can really resonate with people. We try to, it's not always easy, but we really try to fully embody the idea that there's the light within each member of Congress and their staff. So even if we disagree wholeheartedly with what they're saying and what they're doing and it's driving us crazy, we still try to find, okay, what do we have in common with this person? What are our shared values? How can I connect with them and use that connection to shift the conversation forward? So maybe I won't get them to sponsor a carbon tax bill tomorrow, but maybe I can begin to show them why this issue should be removed from this partisan sphere. And I mean, it's not always easy to do, but a few weeks ago I met with my own member of Congress, who's a very conservative member from North Carolina, and I had about 10 minutes to talk with him, and it was my first time meeting him, and I will confess that I did not mention the words climate change to him, but we spent the whole time talking about why, as a person of faith, for me, caring for good stewardship of the environment was so important. And so I was able to ask him, this is what my own faith leads me to say about the environment. What does your faith lead you to say? Because he's a pastor. And so it was so interesting. And he agreed with me that we have to be good stewards and protect the environment. And, we didn't quite get into the policy realm, but I think it was such a good conversation to have because it was showing we have something in common here, and we have similar goals. It's how do we get there together? And maybe the next time I meet with him, I can talk more about solutions. So FCNL's overarching policy goal, like I mentioned, is just to get Congress to have this kind of broad bipartisan acknowledgement that climate change is real, it's occurring already, and that humans are causing it, and we have to do something about it. And so we've been working for the past several years to try to find a Republican member to introduce a resolution that basically acknowledges this and states that climate change is happening and we have to do something about it. And so we were very fortunate enough to finally have a Republican agree to do this. And so we can't get into specifics because we're trying to build support for this initiative before going public with it. But we've been involved over the past 6 or 7 months in helping this office draft the resolution and find co-sponsors. And it's been a really wonderful experience, and it's given me a lot of hope because I really do think members of Congress are searching for a way to shift their stance on this. And so it's how do we provide them with that space? And I don't know if you all heard Congressman Curbelo, who represents kind of a greater Miami district. He's a freshman Republican. He, on Earth Day, had an incredible statement on climate change. He rode in Air Force One with President Obama, and then in a speech he gave, he said, humans are causing climate change, and Congress needs to look for bipartisan solutions to address it. And that was so wonderful that he said this. And so for me, it shows hope, and it shows that this is a conversation that's going to be moving soon. And so how do we get out in front of it and help think, congressmen like Curbelo and others who make bold statements like that, and help them feel supported so they don't so others aren't afraid to follow suit with similar action. So I think it's easy to get discouraged, especially in the face of all the money that's going into politics, and it's hard to think that your voice can make a difference. But there was a study done by the Congressional Management Foundation earlier this year, and they talked to 260 congressional staffers, and they said the most effective way to change a member of Congress's mind is to have a meeting with their constituents about an issue where they hear how the issue is connected to that local community, and they hear those personal stories about why this issue matters and is making a difference in their lives. And that alone can change someone's mind. I mean, there was a vote several years ago on the big cap and trade bill that failed to pass, and there was a Democratic member of Congress who wanted to vote for the bill. He ended up voting for the bill, but the day of the vote, he got 300 calls from people opposing the bill, and only 5 people supporting the bill. And he still followed his conscience and voted for the bill because he knew it was the right thing to do. But how, if it was a member of Congress who didn't really care about the issue, it would have been so easy for him to change and vote the way his constituents were wondering. So I think for us to remember that our voice makes a huge difference. It has the power to change minds, and it does regularly. And to not give up. I know it can be really frustrating sometimes if you have a member of Congress that you don't feel like they represent your viewpoints, and maybe you've tried over and over again to explain kind of why you want an action on a certain issue, and it might seem like they're not listening, but for me, to remain silent and to give up means they're not held accountable to your viewpoint. So even if you feel like you're not getting anywhere, they still have to explain to you why they disagree and why they're refusing to take that action. And so if you keep it up, I think eventually they can shift on the issue. And I think it's also about building a long-term relationship with them. So being willing to put yourself out there and go to their office and meet with the staff person and explain why the issue matters to you so much, that really does make a difference. And the more effort you're able to put into showing that you're not there just to call them and leave, but you really want to grow with them and to learn alongside of them and to help dialogue with them about what's best for the district and your community, can be really effective. I want to hear your thoughts and take questions, but I just want to end on this little quote, which you all probably know, but never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. And honestly, it doesn't take, you just need a vocal, I forget what the exact percentage is, like 10 or 15% of people to be very vocal on an issue. That's all it takes. You don't need to have 100% of the people in a district agreeing with you. It's how do you elevate and amplify the voices of those that do want action on climate change, and how do you show that it's not just the Sierra Club members that want it, but it's also local business leaders, and it's also people who are in the military. The Department of Defense has labeled climate change as a threat multiplier because they're concerned about, all the countries that will disappear because of sea level rise and how it exacerbates conflict. You have major business leaders like Nike, Coke, Cargill, the reinsurance agency, who are all calling for action on climate change. You've got people like Pope Francis, who next week is releasing an encyclical on climate change and the environment. You've got some major leaders calling for action, and so how do you then take that to the local community and show that maybe we do have a vocal group of people that are against action on climate change, but you also have such a wide, diverse perspective of people who do want action? I think as a starting point, if you all haven't been calling or emailing your members of Congress, that's a great first step. I also encourage people who don't feel like they can physically go lobby to write letters to the editor where they mention their member of Congress by name. And these can be brief, 100 words. That's really all it is, responding to some kind of article in the paper and then urging the member of Congress to publicly acknowledge climate change. In terms of lobbying, I do lobby trainings over the phone, over Skype. I can come back here and do one in person, but I think it's, if people are interested in doing this, you gather a small group of people together. You can have 3 or 4 or 5 people. If you want people from kind of a diverse, if you want people who aren't just Quakers, you can approach other organizations or other faith communities that work on this issue and kind of build some kind of coalition. And then it's really simple. You just email or call their district office. You don't even have to come to DC. You just email the local office and say, we'd love to talk to somebody about climate change or whatever issue it is. And realizing that you might not get to meet with the member of Congress themselves for the very first time, but if you kind of, sometimes you get lucky and can, but other times it takes, a year or 2 before you actually get a meeting with the member. But then it's really relatively easy. It's just a conversation about why you care about the issue. And FCNL is really good about providing lobby trainings and can help you think through the structure of, how do you have this conversation that's effective and focused and respectful. So that's training that we're really willing to provide. Yeah, and I think you're right, especially when you can come in and say, here's a list of all the people that back me. So maybe your group of 3 or 4 or 5 has a lot of different community ties, but then you can bring with you the voices of your community behind you, and that's so effective. And I mean, even a visit with Senator Rubio's office, like, that might be really hard to do. And it might be really hard to find the light within him, but figuring that, if he has to know that all these people care about this, and I mean, you can assume that he knows, but by just assuming, he doesn't ever have to actually answer and respond and have those dialogues. And so I definitely think it's worth exploring all of those options. Petitions for us can be really useful. I find they're more effective if you maybe do a petition and then someone goes into that office and says, hey, look, we just had a petition and had 500 people from your district sign it. And then you explain and have that meeting in person. And I think you never know what the petition will be used for. I think it's a great first step. I don't think it's enough. I think if there's a small group from the people who signed the petition can actually then go and have a meeting, that's even better. But I do think they're useful to do, definitely. One thing that FCNL kind of grounds our lobbying in is our way to kind of build that common ground is before the visit begins and before you start talking about the issue, you thank them for something. For some offices, that's really easy to find a thank you. For others, it can be really difficult, and sometimes it is stuff like, thank you for serving our country by representing our voices, or thank you for your work on some tiny little thing. And Senator Rubio, I found a vote that he had that was very positive. It seems kind of obvious, but they had a bunch of votes on the budget, and Senator Nelson, this is very recently, proposed an amendment that basically said Congress can't pass legislation that prevents scientists from using the term climate change, which, as you know, the whole controversy with that in Florida. And Senator Rubio was one of 5 Republicans who voted for that, along with the Democrats. So, that's great. And that's a very small one vote, but it's something that if constituents can say, hey, we noticed you did this, and thank you for doing that. Even if you can't stand everything else he's doing on climate change, that's a good start. And briefly, I just want to say a quick word about why we see a lot of the political representatives in Florida as being so important. And maybe this is obvious, but Florida is ground zero for a lot of the effects of climate change, and so it's a place where there are those stories that can connect with legislators about how this is already impacting the state and communities here and why it's so critically important. Yet there does seem to be such a large percentage of people that don't accept the science of climate change, both in terms of the citizens, but also the political representatives. So there's a lot of space to move the conversation. So we have a couple of resources, one on our website, which I didn't bring with me, but you can find online. It kind of shows all the different major faith traditions, what they say about climate change or creation care, and that's great. So that's really helpful. We also there are organizations that work on climate change from an evangelical perspective that we partner with. So there's a group called the Evangelical Environmental Network. We work very closely with them. Now, often our work, I don't know if we would ever sign a coalition letter that had, Evangelical Environmental Network and Friends Committee on National Legislation, just because for the Evangelical Network to kind of maintain their own legitimacy with their constituents, they need to kind of do their own thing, but it runs parallel to what we're doing with the same goal. And so I think there's definitely resources out there, and you're absolutely right. It's thinking about what the most effective messenger is, which is why I think the interfaith angle is so important, because it's one thing for, myself as a progressive Christian to go talk to somebody about this, but if you can find, here's a whole diverse group of people who have conservative beliefs on other issues and, a whole range, that really can make a huge difference. And that's something we do. We definitely check members of Congress's religion before going on a lobby visit, always. We've spoken with a lot of members, especially in the House of Representatives. They're talking about the Pope's encyclical. Those members who are Catholic, they're talking about it, and some might be dreading it, but others have told us, especially on a staff level, that they're really excited to see what it has to say and how it'll help shift the party's dialogue on climate change. I am reading it, and it's called This Changes Everything by Naomi Klein. And she has a really interesting point, kind of near the beginning, which is where I am, where she talks about one of the reasons that it can be so hard for people to accept the science of climate change is that if their whole political ideology is built around small government and non-intervention and libertarianism, to admit that climate change is happening and that we have to act quickly, that means a whole revamping of our economy and of the way that the government interacts with the local communities, where the government has to have more regulation and they have to play a larger role in kind of making sure that we are able to reduce our emissions. So I thought that was just a fascinating lens to look through. But I do think, there are huge problems with the need for campaign finance reform and the way that money is in politics. We definitely recognize that, but I also think in the meantime, we have to keep working on climate change, and so, so I don't know, I think all these issues have to be kind of tackled simultaneously. Yeah, that's a good question. So I'm not sure how entirely to answer it. I will say there are large networks of both energy companies and of just businesses in general that are doing work on sustainability and climate change, and we're in communication with those networks. So for example, this resolution that we're working on, there's a network of corporations and CEOs that we've actually tapped into, and I haven't personally had a conversation with them, but we've gone through kind of other partners of ours who know them to then say, hey, can you work on this from your own angle? So there's some communication, because I think a lot of the utilities and big oil companies, they want stability. They know this is inevitable. And so there's actually a letter, a couple weeks ago that came out with like 6 major oil company CEOs, all companies based in Europe, that they all signed this letter saying we need action on climate change. And so I think there's that recognition, but at the same time, I don't know, without the stability of some kind of legislation or knowing like we're going to have a price in carbon in 10 years or whatever that looks like, it's really hard for those conversations to happen. But I think it's something that I'm interested in doing, figuring out like, are there ways that we can have conversations directly with those companies? But I also say right now FCNL isn't doing a ton of work in support of the EPA's Clean Power Plan, just because that is so partisan in Congress right now, and so we haven't had a lot of conversations around that issue. And I think there are a lot of utilities that are US based that are trying to prevent those rules from going into place, which is silly for a number of reasons, but especially given so many states are already going to meet those targets without even trying very hard. So we honestly try to avoid talking about the science when we go into congressional offices. And that's for 2 reasons. So I think sometimes constituents will come to us and they'll say, I'm going to meet with my member of Congress tomorrow or their staff, and I put together a 30-page document that tells them everything they need to know about climate science. And it's like, well, that's great, but they're not going to read it. They either have read it and they know and they understand the science and they either believe it or they just want to dismiss it entirely. It's rarely the case that, I think there is a little bit of scientific illiteracy where people haven't ever been sat down and explained exactly how it works. But I think for most people, that won't really, talking about the science won't help. And you don't want to avoid, you want to avoid getting in a situation where it's like me with my set of facts and you with your set of facts, and we're talking past each other and we're not going to come to an agreement. So if we can rather say, so we had a briefing last fall on sea level rise that FCNL put on. And we had amazing speakers. One of them was a chief of an Alaska Native village, and he was able to tell the story of how his community might not exist in like 3 years because of sea level rise. This is happening now. This is a reality now. We had a pastor, an Episcopal priest from Miami, and he said, look, my church is the oldest church in the historic Miami downtown, and we just had major flooding and had to undergo millions of dollar renovation. So I think having those stories to say, okay, science, the argument, the whole debate is over here, but this is what we know, this is our lived reality already, that to kind of avoid that whole conversation. So you don't end up just talking about the science for an hour and get nothing done. Yeah, and that's a great point about Senator Rubio too. Imagine you're him for a second, and he's spent the past few years saying climate change isn't happening, or maybe it's happening but humans aren't causing it. So he officially now, he voted for this amendment that said climate change is real, but it doesn't talk about human causation at all. So he knows climate change is real. So how does he then change his mind? How does he backtrack? He's talked himself into this corner where he said climate change isn't human caused, or we don't know how much is or what isn't, so let's not talk about that. So how does he change his stance on that now that he's talked himself into this position? So then what is the constituent, how do you provide him that path forward, that helps save his face a little bit, or maybe he gets voted out of office. But in the meantime, we can't just assume, we can't just wait for a different makeup of Congress. I mean, if you want congressional legislation to pass this day and age, you need 60 votes because of the whole filibuster thing. And if you want a UN treaty ratified, you need 67 votes in the Senate. And I can't imagine a Senate where either party has 67 members, anytime soon. So you have to work with everyone. And so you have to figure out how do we take those baby steps with them. So quickly also, when the Keystone Pipeline bill was voted on earlier this year, there were a series of amendments that were voted on about climate science. One just said climate change is real and not a hoax. That got 98 votes in the Senate. So climate change is real and not a hoax, according to the Senate. There was another vote that said climate change is real and humans are contributing to it. That got 15 Republican votes in the Senate. Then there was another vote that said climate change is real and humans are significantly contributing to it. That got 5 Republican votes. So 5 is better than none, and 15 is better than none. So it shows that they're trying to walk forward on this conversation. So don't lose hope. So one initial thought, SUIM is going to be hiring a field clerk on EARTHCARE. And so one of the reasons that I'm here is I met with the executive committee yesterday to talk about this position. And so I think whenever that happens, we're unsure what that position will look like yet, but that person can serve as a great organizer, and FCNL is willing to help provide this person with the lobby training skills and some of that to help disseminate here. But what I think would be great is if there are ways to reach out to other local churches and faith groups here that are doing this work, and then having a lobby training and doing a visit. There are many pieces to this, so if people don't feel led to lobby, there are other ways to help support education and outreach components about this. But I think all of it together is really powerful. So FCNL, and I should give this disclaimer, we focus on federal legislation and Congress, but I think the lobbying skills and the tools that we can help provide to people are really applicable at the local and state level as well. And so it's super important to keep tabs on what they're doing and figure out how you can express your voice to those local elected officials as well. So I don't know as much about the local politics just because so much of what I do is Washington-based, but I think, and especially those stories then that you can tell of your work at a local level are really powerful when you're speaking to your federal representatives. We have a shared QUAKER statement on climate change that we worked with QEW and with QUAKER UN office to help draft back last September around the People's Climate March. And you can find it on our website, probably on Q's website, but it has every month we're adding more and more signatures from yearly meetings and monthly meetings and Quakers around the world. So it's really exciting to see that shared statement kind of multiplying. Can I share one last story as like a parting, why I'm really optimistic for what's going forward? This is probably the coolest thing that's ever happened to me. It's an amazing story, and some of you might have, I wrote about it for Friends Journal, so some of you might have heard about this already. But last summer, on my birthday, July 31st, I met with a group of 5, 10, and 11-year-olds from Yardley Friends meeting in Pennsylvania. And they were going to be lobbying later that afternoon their Republican member of Congress, Mike Fitzpatrick, who's fairly moderate Republican. He, back in 2009, voted for the Waxman-Markey cap and trade bill. So he knows climate change is happening. His wife is a scientist. He has 6 children of his own. So I spent, about an hour or 2 hours with these 10, 11-year-olds and helped them think through, okay, like you're meeting with your member of Congress in an hour, like what do you want to say? Like how are we going to do this? Let's practice. And then we went and spoke with him, and he spent 40 minutes with these kids, and they, their main ask of him, one of the little girls said, will you publicly acknowledge that Congress has a moral obligation to address climate change in a bipartisan fashion, out of concern for your own 6 children and all children? I was like, yeah. And one little boy said, Congressman, I play soccer and I have asthma and I'm worried that climate change will make my asthma worse. And there are 200,000 kids in Pennsylvania with asthma. And another little girl was able to really thank him and bond over the fact that he helped clean up the watershed in the park that she went to every weekend. And these children were, young enough that they were articulate and they knew they cared about the issue, but they had no idea what him being Republican meant versus him being Democrat. They just trusted him as their elected official who was going to take care of them and make, laws to make their future better. And so he spent about 40 minutes talking to them, and he, really kind of relating to them as a father figure almost. And he kind of did the politician move where he talked around their question and started talking about Washington and the history of D.C. and the Capitol and did you know that we have a Senate and a House of Representatives type of thing? And so when he was winding up the meeting, one of the little girls said, so are you going to say something about climate change? And he's like, oh, wasn't going to let him get off the hook like that. And I didn't prompt her to say that, so I was so proud. And he said, okay, because of your visit, I'm going to co-sponsor this bill. It's a bill called the PREPARE Act. It's not the most amazing comprehensive climate bill yet, but it's a small step in the right direction. And this bill seeks to help seeks to help local and state governments and different federal agencies kind of share best practices and prepare for extreme weather events. So it doesn't talk about climate change, but it's extreme weather preparedness, and it references the National Climate Assessment. So he agreed to co-sponsor that bill. He told the children, because you came in and talked to me and lobbied, I'll do this. He then went around and told other congressional offices that the reason why he was co-sponsoring was because of their visit. And he then, since that visit, he's proceeded to develop this amazing relationship with them, where several days later, the kids were getting a tour of the Capitol building, and he kind of came down. He was on the floor voting, and they were up in the balcony watching him, and he looked up and saw them, and he went up and got them and brought them down on the legislative floor to show them around, and spoke to them then for 20 minutes about bipartisanship. And then the children returned to their meeting in Pennsylvania, and I helped them draft a petition that basically said, we thank Congressman Fitzpatrick for co-sponsoring this bill. We urge him and all of our leaders in Pennsylvania, regardless of political party, to publicly acknowledge climate change. And they were gathering signatures at their meeting house, and they invited the congressman to come to the meeting to see the work that they were doing to help support this bill that he now co-sponsored. And he signed their petition, which I think is great. And then they proceeded to have another lobby visit with him a few months ago, back in March, where they asked him again, what are you going to do about climate change? So really cool for me just to see their sustained interest and what an experience for them at an early age to know that their voice matters and that participating in this democratic process is powerful and effective and it actually works. And raising the youth voice of these are the kids that are going to be left on this earth, 50, 60 years from now. This is their future, and members of Congress have this moral obligation to act on it. And so it was just the coolest story, and I think shows that there is hope and there are ways to reach members of Congress on this issue. So. Yeah. So in 2 weeks, I'm going to be in Rome at an Emerging Faith Leaders Climate Convergence. So because of the Pope's encyclical next week that he's releasing, there's this international climate change group called ourvoices.net, and they're an organization that tries to help amplify faith voices around the world to kind of pray for the upcoming climate negotiations. So they're funding 100 people who are aged 21 to 40 who from around the world, from different faith traditions, like every possible religion you can think of, are going to be represented in Rome in a few weeks to talk about climate change from a faith perspective and kind of share what we're doing and exchange ideas and kind of plan how we can be more effective in our communities. So I will be going to that, and I'm thrilled about that opportunity. Yeah. Thank you.
And that's Our Voices?
Ourvoices.net. Mm-hmm.